I remember that Christmas like it was a frozen photograph, beautiful on the outside but cold, lifeless, and impossible to touch. The snow fell softly against the windows, twinkling like tiny stars, and the smell of cinnamon and pine filled the house. But inside there was nothing. No warmth, no laughter. Not for me. I walked into the living room, heart thumping, expecting something. A smile, a hug, even a passing glance. But there was nothing. My parents, so busy with my younger brother, oh, how they doted on him, barely spared me a glance. The gifts I had asked for, the little things I had hoped for, were neatly stacked for him. My name wasn't even mentioned when they handed them out. I sat there quietly, pretending not to feel the sting. Pretending I didn't notice the way they whispered and laughed with him, how their eyes lit up for every little thing he did. The room was filled with chatter, but my presence seemed invisible, as if I was a ghost sitting among them. I wanted to speak up, to yell, to demand that they see me. But instead I stayed quiet. My voice, swallowed by years of being overlooked, remained trapped inside. I had learned, painfully, that any protest would only bring more mockery or dismissal. So I said nothing. I simply watched. I watched the family I had loved all my life focus their attention somewhere else. I watched their smiles and laughter, the kind that made my chest ache with longing. And in that silence, something else began to grow inside me. An ember of anger, yes, but also something sharper. A quiet, burning determination. This wasn't the first Christmas I had been ignored. It wasn't even the first time I had felt like I didn't matter. But this year it felt different. The quiet I had been practicing for so long wasn't just survival anymore. It was becoming my strength. I remember the way my hands clenched into fists under the table, my knuckles white, not from rage alone, but from the effort of holding back tears. I wanted them to see me, not like this, not as a shadow in the corner, but as someone who mattered, someone who could no longer be ignored. And yet, I had to wait. I had to stay quiet, blend into the background, and let the night pass without making a scene. My parents would never expect what was coming, and that made the idea of it even sweeter. So I smiled. I nodded. I laughed when they expected it. I sat there, a silent observer of my own heartbreak, knowing that the time to act would come later. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the soft creak of the house settling, I made a promise to myself. I promised that next Christmas, or maybe even sooner, they would not be able to ignore me. I would find a way to make them see, truly see, all the years they had taken me for granted. And in that silent, cold room, beneath the twinkling lights and the warm smells of celebration, the seed of my plan was planted. I didn't know yet exactly how I would do it. I only knew one thing: they would remember me. They would feel the weight of their neglect. And when they did, oh, they would never forget it. I spent the rest of that night staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the other Christmases, birthdays, and ordinary days that had slipped through my fingers like sand. Every time I had hoped for even a little recognition, it had been snatched away. Every time I had reached out for affection, it had been ignored, or worse, laughed at. I remembered last year, how I had spent hours carefully wrapping a present for my mom, imagining the smile on her face when she opened it. I'd stayed up late, writing a note, folding it neatly into the box. When I handed it to her, she barely glanced at it, then tossed it aside in favor of my brother's gift, which had been bought at the last minute. The sting had been sharp, but I didn't say a word. I had learned quickly that any sign of disappointment was met with annoyance, or worse, mockery. And my dad. Oh, my dad. I thought he saw me. I thought he noticed the quiet, careful effort I put into school, into chores, into trying to be good enough. But no. He would smile at my brother, pat him on the back, make little jokes that made the whole family laugh. And me? I would sit there nodding along, pretending I was fine, pretending it didn't hurt to be invisible in my own home. It wasn't that I wanted gifts or attention. I wanted to matter. I wanted someone to notice the small victories I had quietly achieved, the sacrifices I had made just to keep the peace. I wanted someone to see that I had a heart, a mind, a soul that deserved acknowledgement. But year after year, it felt like I was fading, dissolving into the background while the world celebrated everyone else. I even remembered the time I had gotten the highest score in a school project, something I had poured every ounce of effort into. I had come home expecting at least a word of praise. Instead, my dad muttered something like, "That's nice," before moving on to discuss my brother's soccer game. My heart had shattered in that moment, not in anger, not in frustration, but in that slow, sinking way that comes when you realize no one is keeping track of you at all. And it wasn't just my parents. Relatives, neighbors, even friends would comment on my brother first, notice his achievements, his quirks, his laughter, while I remained a footnote, someone barely worth a glance. I learned to laugh at the right moments, smile when expected, and hide the bitterness that threatened to bubble up inside me. But the quiet didn't make the pain go away. It just festered, buried beneath layers of patience and silence. Every ignored comment, every forgotten achievement, every overlooked gift became a brick in a wall. A wall of determination, yes, but also a wall of anger that I had no right to show. I spent hours replaying every slight in my mind, remembering the laughter I hadn't been invited to, the hugs I hadn't received, the words of encouragement that had gone to someone else. And slowly, very slowly, I began to understand something. If I wanted to be seen, if I wanted to matter, I would have to make them see me. Not through begging or pleading, but through action. That action, I realized, would not come tonight, or tomorrow, or even next week. It would come at the perfect moment when they least expected it. I would be patient. I would be silent. I would let them continue to underestimate me while I quietly prepared for the day they would finally regret ignoring me. And so, in the quiet of my room, surrounded by the muted sounds of the sleeping house, I embraced my pain. I fed it, nurtured it, and let it grow into something stronger. Because I knew that pain alone wasn't enough. I needed a plan. I needed patience. I needed precision. By the time I drifted into a restless sleep, I wasn't just a child who had been ignored. I was someone who was learning the power of quiet endurance. Someone who was beginning to understand that being underestimated could be a weapon if wielded correctly. And deep inside, in the hollow where loneliness had lived for so long, a spark began to burn. A spark that whispered softly but clearly, "They will see me. They will feel the weight of every year they ignored me. And when they do, they will never forget it." The next Christmas arrived, and with it, the same familiar chill. The air inside the house wasn't cold, it was worse. It was heavy with expectation and exclusion. My parents bustled around, their energy all devoted to my younger brother, and I could feel the invisible barrier between us growing thicker with every passing second. I tried to blend into the background, sitting quietly at the table, pretending to be happy for my family. I smiled when they laughed. I nodded when they spoke. I even complimented the decorations, the food, the presents. I was the perfect invisible child, smiling, polite, quiet. And inside, a storm was building. Then it happened. The moment that would finally tip me over the edge. It was during dinner. My mom had just handed my brother the last gift, a shiny, perfectly wrapped box that he tore into with glee. My dad leaned over, ruffling his hair, his eyes sparkling with pride. And then, they both turned toward me, but it wasn't a look of warmth or love. It was a glance of obligation. A half-hearted smile, the kind you give when you feel you have to, not when you want to. And in that instant, something inside me snapped, not with rage, but with the cold. Sharp clarity of someone who has been ignored for too long. I could feel every slight from the past decade rushing back in waves. The forgotten birthdays, the overlooked achievements, the silent dinners, the endless comparisons. I thought about the countless times I had swallowed my hurt, swallowed my pride, and swallowed my voice. And now, staring at them across the table, I realized I could no longer do that. But I didn't react immediately. I didn't storm out or shout. That would have been expected. That would have been ordinary. No, I stayed quiet, as I always had. I held my fork, pretending to eat, smiling when required, nodding when spoken to. But inside, my mind was already moving, calculating. This was the breaking point, yes, but it was also the beginning. Because I knew one thing for certain. I would make them pay. Not in anger, not in confrontation, but in a way they would never forget. I would make them realize the weight of every year they had ignored me, every word they had dismissed, every achievement they had overlooked. As the dinner continued, I observed them closely, noting their habits, their pride, the small ways they undervalued me, each gesture, each laugh at my brother's antics, each absent glance in my direction, added fuel to the fire I had been carefully nurturing for years. I could almost see it, the future moment of revelation. Their faces when they finally understood that I wasn't invisible, that I had been quietly waiting, quietly planning, quietly building myself into someone who mattered, that their neglect had created a storm they would not be able to ignore. And in that moment, something unexpected happened. My brother, oblivious to the tension building across the table, looked at me and smiled. A simple, innocent smile. And for a brief, fleeting second, I almost felt guilty for the plan forming in my mind. But then I remembered I wasn't angry at him. He was just a child. This was about the adults. The ones who should have seen me, the ones who had ignored me all my life. By the time dessert arrived, the stage was set. My parents were fully engrossed in their little world, unaware that the quiet, overlooked child sitting across from them had changed. I was no longer just a passive observer. I was patient. I was poised. I was ready. That night, as they went to bed, unaware of the storm brewing, I sat alone in the living room, my mind replaying every slight and every insult. And I knew. The perfect moment for revenge, carefully measured, clever, and unforgettable, was coming soon. They would not see it coming. Not even a hint. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small or invisible. I felt powerful. I felt seen, even if they couldn't recognize it yet. And in that quiet, tense Christmas night, I realized the truth I had always known. Sometimes, silence is stronger than words. And patience. Patience can be deadly. I didn't want revenge that would ruin someone forever. I wanted something cleaner, something precise that would force them to feel what they had made me feel for years. Small, unseen, embarrassed. I wanted a moment that would steal their certainty, the smug calm that comes from always being the center of attention. I wanted them to know without a doubt that I had been right there all along. So I began to plan. Slowly. Quietly. Like someone building a clock in the dark, careful with every piece, patient for the right alignment. I made lists in my head. I watched and learned. I wrote down little things they said, patterns they followed, things they boasted about. Pride has a rhythm, and once you learn it, you can set it to fall like a row of dominoes. First, I mapped out their weaknesses. My dad loved appearances, his job, the car, the way he looked to neighbors. He fed on compliments and status. My mom lived for praise too, especially from relatives and friends. She would post photos with a certain smile, make certain comments at gatherings that always drew attention back to her. That was their currency, public approval. I could work with that. I didn't need to humiliate them in private. I needed to unsettle them where they were most comfortable, in front of others. Then I found allies, quiet ones, almost invisible like me. There were a few relatives who had seen the way my parents behaved but never said anything. A cousin who had been surprised by their favoritism. A neighbor who'd remarked once that my brother always seemed to get the spotlight. I didn't recruit armies. I didn't need to. I simply listened. I let others tell their small stories, and I saved them in my mind like pieces of evidence. They would help my plan feel inevitable, not forced. Next, I prepared my resources. I saved money from odd jobs, from late-night shifts and tutoring gigs. I studied how to present things, how to look composed when delivering a hard truth. I learned to write clear notes, to place facts where people would find them, to speak with calm authority. I practiced making my voice steady, not hysterical, because a shaking voice would be dismissed. I recorded small details, dates, incidents, the exact words they used when they dismissed me. I was building a case, not a confrontation, but the core of my plan wasn't documents or evidence. It was timing and context. I didn't want a messy outburst. I wanted a reveal that would hit the heart of their pride and force them into public reflection. I imagined a family gathering, someone else's celebration, where there would be cousins, neighbors, that one aunt who always shared things on social media. That was perfect. Pride thrives in public, and so would the reckoning. I also prepared an emotional lever. Over the months, I cultivated small successes of my own. Quiet achievements I could present not as proof of superiority, but as undeniable signs that I had been living my life, building quietly while they ignored me. I saved acceptance letters, certificates, photos from volunteer work, proofs of payslips, small tokens of independence. Nothing flashy, just undeniable competence. When shown at the right moment, these facts would interrupt the narrative they had built about me. The invisible child, the one who never mattered. I built contingencies. If they tried to deny, I had witnesses. If they tried to joke it away, I would have the composure to respond with a single, cold question that would strip the laughter away. If they tried to deflect, I would not follow them into their games. The plan was a simple machine. Set up the reveal, show the truth, step back, let it work. Precision. No chaos. No cruelty. Just exposure. The kind that leaves people with nowhere to hide but themselves. There was something else I had to prepare for. My own doubts. I was scared. Not of being caught, that wouldn't have mattered, but of changing into someone I didn't recognize. I asked myself difficult questions. Would I forgive them afterward? Could I bear the aftermath? Was this worth the pain it might cause? I sat with those doubts until they softened. In the end, I realized I wasn't after vengeance for vengeance's sake. I wanted recognition, an honest reckoning that might change how they saw me, and perhaps change them too. So I rehearsed. In front of a mirror, I practiced a calm tone. I practiced letting silence do the work. I practiced walking away. I prepared to not gloat when the moment came. Revenge that wears itself out with triumph is petty. What I wanted was something sharper, an undeniable truth presented with dignity. That would be far more devastating than any shouted accusation. Weeks turned into months. I quietly scheduled things. I built my life in small, careful steps so that when the moment came, what I presented would be irrefutable. I bought a modest but meaningful outfit for the occasion. Nothing showy, just an air of someone who had taken care of themselves. I reserved a seat in a family gathering where everyone would be present, noting who would likely speak and who would be on their phones. I made sure there would be witnesses, and I made sure their witnesses had already seen hints of what I planned to reveal, so when it unfolded, people wouldn't think it was a random outburst from a hurt child. They would see it as the final chapter of a story everyone had been living with, whether they acknowledged it or not. And through all of this, I kept my face calm. I smiled at holidays, helped set the table, pretended to be content. People once again took me for granted, and that was the point. If they expected me to explode, they'd be ready to dismiss me. If they expected nothing, the reveal would land like a stone in calm water, with ripples that would reach every corner of that house. The final piece of the plan was the reveal itself. I knew the exact moment I would speak, the exact question I would ask, the exact thing I would place in front of them. I didn't want to say it here, not yet. Plans, when spoken aloud too early, lose their power. But I promised myself one thing. When they saw what I had saved, what I had kept, and how quietly I had built a life outside their attention, I would let the silence between us speak first. I would let them feel the years. I would let them understand for the first time what it was to be unseen. I was ready. The slow burn had become a steady flame. The plan, patient, precise, inevitable, was waiting for its cue. And with every day that passed, my confidence grew. Not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I wanted to be recognized. Because after years of disappearing, I finally had the power to make them look, and when they did, there would be no lies left to hide behind. The day came like any other on the surface. Sunlight pouring through windows, the same kettle whistling on the stove, the same faint hum of the neighbor's radio down the street. That normalcy was part of the plan. People don't brace for storms when the sky looks blue. They don't suspect the quiet one, the one who smiles and passes the salt, of having built an entire life in secret. It was a family gathering at Aunt Layla's house, a Sunday barbecue that pulled in cousins, grandparents, neighbors, and that aunt who loved to take photos for social media, exactly the kind of crowd where my parents felt safe and sure of themselves. They arrived early, triumphant in their usual way. My father's chest puffed up with stories about work, my mother adjusting her blouse and laughing a little too loudly at compliments. Everyone fell into their familiar roles, and I watched them, patient and steady, from the background like I had rehearsed 1,000 times. I had set the scene carefully. A small stack of envelopes lay in my bag, quiet proof of things I had done. A scholarship letter folded with care, a thank you email printed from a volunteer coordinator, a bank deposit slip from the tutoring jobs I'd taken, a certificate from a community program. I wasn't showing off trophies. I was showing evidence of a life that had been lived, not merely observed. I wanted the facts to speak where my past pleas had failed. The moment I had planned for was during the toast, when everyone raised a glass and smiled, when attention drifted and the room relaxed into that warm, self-satisfied haze parents love. I took my place at the long table, sat tall, and waited for the right silence. My mouth was dry, but my hands were steady. I had practiced this calm in the mirror, and it worked now. The calm didn't look like rage. It looked like someone who had finally prepared to be heard. My cousin stood toasts, clinking glasses, and the chatter softened. My father made a small joke. My mother laughed, her voice like wind chimes. Then, with the exact timing I had imagined, I reached into my bag, pulled out the first envelope, and set it on the table between us. The sound was soft but sharp, like a domino's first tap. "Excuse me," I said, and everyone turned. The room stilled, not just because I had spoken, but because there was something about the way I spoke that said this wasn't a child having a tantrum. I spoke plainly, no theatrics, no pleading. "I want to say something," I continued. "Not to accuse. Just to show you who I am." Eyes flicked between me and my parents. I saw the brief confusion, the look my dad gave my mother as if to say, "Is this necessary?" My mother's smile faltered. That tiny change was all I needed. I opened the first envelope and laid it in front of my father, the scholarship acceptance that bore my name. There it was, printed and precise. No flourish, no self-aggrandizement, just the letter. I watched as his fingers hovered over it, then withdrew. "Where did this come from?" he asked, voice threaded with the faintest note of defensiveness. "It came from months of work," I said. "From nights I studied while you watched the game. From jobs I took so I could pay for my own things. It came from not asking to be noticed because I was told not to make a fuss." A murmur ran through the table. My aunt leaned forward. My cousin's eyes widened. I placed the next envelope down, the receipt from the tutoring center where I had worked weekends, my name printed on the deposit slip. Then the certificate from the community program, the emails thanking me for volunteer hours. Each piece was small, but together they formed a pattern that no one could easily dismiss. My mother's face drained of color. "Oh," she said softly, like someone who had been slapped by sudden realization. I did not raise my voice. I didn't say the word ignored. I let the silence and the facts speak for me. I watched them try to regroup. My father's first instinct was to joke, to reassert control with a comment about how proud they were, except the words didn't come. The script they had so often relied on had been interrupted. "Why didn't you tell us?" My mother asked later as if that answered everything. Her question was a shield, but it was also a confession. She had never thought to ask. I told the truth, calm and short. Because nobody ever asked. Because every time I tried, it became a joke. Because I learned to be quiet. The room shifted. The neighbors who had been half listening suddenly paid full attention. My cousin said something like, "You did all this?" "Wow." The aunt with the camera sank back, fingers frozen over her phone, the angles of her smile collapsing. Then came my pivot, the thing I had prepared to say, but had not rehearsed to the point of losing its edge. I placed one more paper on the table, a short letter I had written, addressed simply to the family who never noticed me. It was a quiet recounting of small slights, written not as accusation, but as a chronicle. It mentioned dates, small moments, the times I'd been left out of photos, overlooked at parties, dismissed when I spoke up. I read a paragraph aloud, not long, nothing theatrical, just lines that carried the weight of years. As I read, faces changed. Laughter died in mouths. The people who had been chatting and snacking fell silent and listened. My father's jaw tightened. My mother's eyes shimmered. No one laughed and no one made a joke. The letter was simple, but it was impossible to ignore. What happened next wasn't the dramatic collapse I had once imagined. There was no sobbing confessions or cinematic apologies. Instead, there was a few moments of stunned stillness, an honest, painful pause where my parents realized they had been the architects of my invisibility. My brother, who had been playing at the edge of the yard, wandered back to the table. He looked from me to our parents, sensing the change in the air. He didn't understand the full weight of what had happened, but he noticed the seriousness on our faces. He sat down quietly, as if he had learned from the adults that something important was unfolding. My mother finally spoke, voice small. She began, but the words trembled and stopped. My father cleared his throat, the first adult response like a raft trying to find shore. There was no grand victory in that moment. No pounding of chests, no dramatic gloating from me. Instead, there was recognition, a painful, raw, and honest recognition that they had overlooked me. And sometimes recognition is more devastating than any shouted accusation. I folded my letter and stood up. I didn't wait for applause or apology. I had given them what I wanted, the truth, laid out plainly and calmly, with witnesses present. I collected my things and left the table, and as I walked through the room, a neighbor caught my eye and nodded, an act so small it almost went unnoticed. But to me, it felt like a bridge being built. Outside in the cool evening air, I breathed for the first time in months. The plan had worked, not by breaking them, but by making them see. I hadn't sought to punish. I had sought to reveal. That distinction mattered to me. As I looked back through the window at the figures inside, heads bowed and mouths closed, I felt something like relief. The years of being unseen had ended, not with a scream, but with a read receipt of proof they couldn't ignore. But the night was not over. There were words that would follow, explanations and justifications. There would be aftermath, awkward meals, measured apologies, defensive silences, and there would be choices to make on both sides. For now, though, the first step had been taken. The quiet child had spoken, and the house that had learned to overlook me now had to confront what they had done. I walked home under a sky that felt the same as it had in the morning, but inside everything had shifted. The silence that had sheltered me for years had become my instrument, and in that stillness I had found my power. After that night, nothing in the house felt quite the same. My parents no longer looked at me with casual dismissal, though they were unsure what to do with the recognition I had forced into their hands. It wasn't instant forgiveness. It wasn't instant reconciliation, but it was something far more powerful: awareness. The first days afterward were quiet. I went about my life as usual, but the atmosphere at home was charged with a new tension. My father, usually quick with a joke to brush things aside, now hesitated before speaking. My mother, who had always laughed off my comments as trivial, seemed to measure her words carefully. It was subtle, but I could feel the change. They were seeing me, not just glancing at me or hearing me, but truly registering my presence, my independence, my achievements. Family gatherings became strange in a way I hadn't expected. Relatives who had never noticed my quiet patience now asked questions, complimented accomplishments, and, though awkwardly, acknowledged the work I had done. Some of them seemed confused, as if they had been asleep for years and suddenly woken to a reality they had ignored. Others offered small congratulations, hesitant but genuine. The truth had a ripple effect, and even small waves of recognition felt like a tide finally shifting in my favor. And my parents? They reacted in different ways. My father retreated at first, as though recalibrating himself. There was no apology, no dramatic confession, just a quiet awareness in his eyes, the kind that comes when someone realizes they have been wrong for far too long. My mother tried at first to explain, to defend, to excuse her behavior, but even she stumbled over her words, the realization clear in the cracks of her sentences. It was strange watching them navigate this new dynamic. I could see the discomfort of being confronted by years of neglect without the usual defenses. And while part of me wanted to revel in it, I resisted. My goal had never been cruelty. It had been acknowledgement. It had been justice without malice. In the following weeks, things slowly shifted. Conversations became more balanced. My opinions began to matter. My achievements were no longer invisible. And even my younger brother, who had always been the center of attention, began to see me differently. Not as competition, not as someone to be compared against, but as a person who had quietly held his own, who had waited patiently for recognition, and finally demanded it in a way that could not be ignored. I also learned something unexpected. Standing up in this quiet, calculated way gave me a confidence that extended beyond the family. I realized that being overlooked for so long had sharpened my observation, strengthened my patience, and honed my ability to act decisively. I had learned to turn invisibility into a strategy, and in doing so, I had discovered a power within myself I didn't know existed. Yet the aftermath wasn't without discomfort. My parents struggled to express the right words. They stumbled over apologies. They asked questions they hadn't asked before, trying to understand how they had failed me. Some days, it was exhausting to maintain the calm, collected persona I had cultivated for so long. But I understood that true change, even in them, would take time. And I was ready to let it take its course, knowing I had already reclaimed what had been mine: my presence, my dignity, my voice. Perhaps the most important change was in me. I no longer felt small in my own home. I no longer felt the sting of being invisible. I realized that recognition isn't always immediate, and it isn't always easy to claim. But with patience, clarity, and quiet strength, it is possible to demand it without destroying others in the process. That lesson stayed with me, a quiet triumph etched into my confidence. By the time the next holiday came around, things were different. My parents acknowledged me before my brother. They listened. They asked questions. They smiled at my achievements, not because they had to, but because they had learned finally that I had always deserved their attention. And while there was still tension and awkwardness, it was balanced by a new respect that hadn't existed before. In the quiet aftermath of the plan, I discovered something invaluable. Revenge doesn't have to be loud or destructive to be effective. Sometimes the most powerful kind is patient, deliberate, and precise. It forces people to see the truth on their own, without theatrics or tantrums. And in the process, it teaches you something about yourself, that you are stronger than the neglect, more resilient than the silence, and capable of shaping how others perceive you, without losing your integrity in the process. Sitting alone in my room that evening, after the gathering had ended and the house had finally grown quiet, I allowed myself to breathe. The weight of years, the small, sharp hurts, the moments of being unseen, the quiet ache of longing for recognition, felt lighter now. Not gone, never gone entirely, but lighter. And I understood something profound. Patience, strategy, and self-respect had given me something that anger or shouting never could. I thought about my parents. I realized that their failure to notice me wasn't entirely malicious. They had habits, routines, blind spots, pride, and preoccupations. But it had still hurt. And no matter the reason, the responsibility for my invisibility had always rested on them. The difference now was that I had reclaimed control. I had transformed years of neglect into a quiet, unshakable strength. I also thought about my younger brother, who had always been at the center of attention. I didn't feel resentment toward him anymore. He was a child, unaware, innocent in a way I had once been. And perhaps in seeing me finally acknowledged, he had learned something as well. That everyone deserves to be seen, that patience can be powerful, and that silence is sometimes the precursor to strength. The real morale, I realized, wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition, respect, and the quiet power of patience. Being overlooked doesn't make someone weak. Being ignored doesn't define you. What matters is what you do with the silence. You can let it break you, or you can let it build you. You can let it fester into bitterness, or you can let it sharpen your mind, your patience, your ability to act when the time is right. I also learned that justice doesn't have to be loud, aggressive, or cruel. Sometimes the most powerful justice is subtle, deliberate, and undeniable. It doesn't humiliate, it illuminates. It forces people to see the truth they've ignored without descending into chaos. And in that illumination, change becomes possible, not only in them, but in yourself. Looking back, I realized the true victory wasn't in the moment when my parents finally acknowledged me. That was satisfying, yes, but fleeting. The lasting victory was in the years I had spent cultivating myself quietly, in the calm determination I had developed, in the patience and strategy that had allowed me to act with precision. That was my power. That was my liberation. And so, as I sat there reflecting on the events, I understood this. Life will not always see your worth immediately. People will sometimes overlook you, underestimate you, and dismiss you. But being silent, being patient, and preparing yourself for the right moment, those are not weaknesses. They are tools. Tools that, when used wisely, allow you to take control of the narrative of your life, to demand acknowledgement, and to remind the world that being unseen does not mean being powerless. For anyone listening to my story, the lesson is simple. Your voice matters. Your presence matters, and your patience has value. You don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to confront to be recognized. Sometimes the quietest, most deliberate actions leave the deepest impact. And when you finally choose to act, do so with integrity, with calm strength, and with the knowledge that the years of being overlooked have given you an advantage that no one can take away. The silence that had once hurt me became my greatest ally. The patience that had once felt like suffering became my strength. And the quiet, steady journey to being seen, truly seen, taught me something that no neglect, no oversight, and no slight could ever take from me. That I am worthy. I am capable, and I am unbreakable. And in the end, that is more powerful than any applause, any apology, or any acknowledgement I could have demanded. Recognition earned, when paired with patience and dignity, is a force that lasts forever.